In the beginning, there was chaos, a gaping abyss, dark and unformed. Out of the abyss emerged three primordial elements: Gaia, the earth; Tartarus, a cave-like space under the earth; and Eros, sexual desire. Other beings came forth from these primordial elements, including Uranos, the sky. Gaia and Uranos mated, and their union produced the first generation of gods, the Titans. It was only after a great war between the Titans and the Olympians, a second generation of gods, that humanity as we know it came into being. So begins the story of the creation according to Greek mythology. But this story tells us much more than how the Greeks thought the world came to be. Like other great myths, it opens a window onto the entire culture that produced it. We learn how the ancient Greeks saw themselves in relationship to the natural world, the divine world, and other creatures. We get a sense of their moral universe as well as the cosmic universe. And we get a taste of the ancient Greek imagination, how it expressed beauty, virtue, conflict, and evil. In this 12-lecture series, we'll explore the great myths of Greece, Rome, and other parts of ancient Europe. These great myths are much more than entertaining stories. They carried weight in their cultures by explaining the world and by investing everyday life with meaning for ancient peoples. And thousands of years later, many of these myths still speak to our own universal human experience. This is the art of mythology, setting human experience on a cosmic stage. The great mythologies reflect the particular experiences and worldviews of particular peoples, yet they contain kernels of truth about human experience that transcend space and time. As we begin this journey, it's important to think about what we mean by myth. In everyday conversation, people often use the word myth to suggest that a story is fake or untrue. The word has a negative connotation, but that's not the case here. Instead, I'm going to use the term, as many other scholars do, to refer to a story that has meaning or significance beyond the story itself. It's also important to note that myth is not religion. Religion involves beliefs, ritual and bodily practices, history, institutions, and normative values. Mythology is, at its foundation, storytelling. Now, myth often draws on or speaks to religious traditions, but myth itself is best understood as stories that provide an explanation for various cultural elements, investing those elements with an origin, purpose, and value. Some scholars make sharp distinctions between myths, legends, and folk tales, while I resist those distinctions, particularly when I'm comparing story traditions from around the world with one another. In my experience, the term folk tale gets used dismissively. So think about this for a minute. We talk about great mythologies, but do we ever talk about great folk tales? These distinctions have been used to suggest that one set of stories is more significant than another, and I disagree with that view. For that reason, in this series, I'll refer to story traditions using terms such as myth, legend, and folk tales interchangeably. So let's continue with the Greek creation story. As I mentioned, the primordial Uranos fathered the first generation of gods known as the Titans. The Titans were physically imposing and virtually immortal, but their father despised them. Uranos banished his offspring to Tartarus, the dark cave-like region under the earth. This is often interpreted as Uranos trying to unbirth his own children by shoving them into dark caverns, as if he were shoving them back into the womb. Kronos, one of Uranos' sons and the leader of the Titans, hated his father because of this banishment. According to the legend, Kronos attacked his father with the help of his mother. Ultimately, he cut off his father's genitalia, castrating him. We'll see in upcoming lectures that the theme of father-son conflict appears repeatedly in Greek mythology. For some reason, stories about fathers rejecting their sons and sons murdering their fathers resonated with the Greeks. There's something universal about sons wanting to supplant their fathers, but Greek mythology features this conflict much more often than other traditions. After Kronos defeated his father, he settled down with Rhea, who was both his sister and his wife. This also isn't unusual in Greek mythology. Lots of gods marry their sisters, and we know that this happened in upper-crust ancient Greek families as well, so the mythology here reflects a social reality. Kronos and his sister wife Rhea had several children, including the first generation of Olympian gods. These were the most famous gods, the ones who would ultimately rule over the earth from Mount Olympus. According to the great ancient Greek poet Hesiod, the age of Kronos' rule was the Golden Age, the age in which the first race of humans was created, a race that long predated ours. Hesiod describes the Golden Age by saying, "Men lived like gods, without sorrow of heart, remote and free from toil and grief. Miserable age rested not on them, but with legs and arms never failing, they made merry with feasting beyond the reach of all evils. When they died, it was as though they were overcome with sleep, and they had all good things. They dwelt in ease and peace." Now, of course, this perfect age couldn't last. It never does in creation stories. As you can imagine, Kronos worried that his children might do to him what he had done to his own father. In an attempt to avoid this, Kronos decided to eat his children. He swallowed them one by one as they were born, but this strategy turned out to be short-sighted. Rhea, the mother in this story, became a bit tired of Kronos eating all their offspring. So when Zeus, the youngest child, was born, she decided to trick Kronos. She switched the baby Zeus with a stone, and Kronos didn't seem to notice. He swallowed the stone instead of his infant son, and Rhea hid Zeus on the island of Crete until he grew up. Eventually, when Zeus was full-grown, he returned home. Zeus forced Kronos to regurgitate the stone and all of Zeus's siblings. Then he was joined by the other Olympic gods in an attack against Kronos and the other Titans. The battle between the Titans and the Olympic gods, known as the War of the Titans, lasted for 10 years. Greek myth contained several different versions of the war, but in every version, Zeus ultimately triumphed. After Zeus and the gods defeated the Titans, they forced the Titans underground, bound them with chains in the same prison where Uranos had previously kept them captive. Later, the Olympians also vanquished a race of giants that Gaia bore in an attempt to restore the Titans, her children, to power. And from that point forward, the Olympian gods ruled, having displaced the Titans forever. How do we make sense of all of this? What kind of a worldview imagines fathers swallowing their infant children or banishing them to the bowels of the earth? And why tell stories about a former generation of gods, a step removed from the Olympian gods? We don't have any definite answers to these questions, but ancient Greek stories about a primordial time and a primordial race suggest two things to me. First, they depict a world of violence and hardship. To live was to experience hardship and suffering. The question was how to respond. Second, the Greeks valued the skills and qualities that enabled them to triumph over violence, chaos, and aggression. We'll see this come up in a later lecture in the story of Odysseus, the hero of Homer's Odyssey. He's not always a good man, but he's a brave, clever, sometimes deceptive man who learns from his experiences. And because of that, he manages to survive and to take back control of his home and his family. The story of the Titans becomes a kind of cautionary tale for future generations. Even the mighty can fall, sometimes at the hands of their own kin. It takes not only strength, but cunning and wisdom to survive. Some Greek thinkers drew direct connections between the Titans and humanity. That is, humanity in their day, not the early humans of the Golden Age. Olympiodorus argued that contemporary humanity arose out of the ashes of the burning Titan corpses when the Titans were ultimately defeated. Other early writers implied that humanity was born out of the blood shed by the Titans in their war against Zeus. According to Plato, the human body is titanic in nature, while the soul is divine. All of these perspectives suggest that humanity contains some titanic element, and that this element is at war with other elements within us. They also seem to place the Greeks in an uncertain relationship with the powerful yet capricious gods who were in charge of their world. And that may be just the way they saw themselves with respect to their divinities. At this point, it might be helpful to talk about the sources we have for the stories of the Titans and other Greek mythology. Originally, many of the stories that we know took shape as oral traditions. That is, they were transmitted orally through storytellers and were only written down later. The flowering of Greek mythology occurred during the Archaic and Classical periods from roughly 700 BCE until 323 BCE, when Alexander the Great died. Greece embraced poetry and epics and theater, all of which included a heavy dose of mythology. From about 700 BCE on, Greece began to keep written records, adopted the Phoenician alphabet, and then subsequently developed its own alphabet, and self-governing city-states began to establish themselves. Throughout this critical period in the development of Greek mythology, the people of the Greek city-states experienced several long, violent conflicts, particularly between about 500 and 323 BCE throughout the entire classical period. Here we see similarities between the Greek experience and the myths they tell about the first generation of the gods. For hundreds of years, ancient Greek life meant conflict, and the stories of the Titans reflect this. Probably the most famous author of Greek myths is Homer, who's generally credited with writing the grand epic poems focused on the Trojan War and its aftermath, the Iliad and the Odyssey. You may have seen images of Homer as an elderly blind man. There's considerable debate surrounding him, including whether or not a real Homer ever existed, and if he did, whether all the works attributed to him were actually composed by him. Some scholars believe that Homer is actually a composite of several different people. For our purposes, we'll refer to Homer as if he did exist, and we'll date him to the 8th century BCE, just as the Greeks were stepping into the Archaic period. There's another important Greek author I've already mentioned, Hesiod. Hesiod is usually dated to around 700 BCE, and his material differs a bit from Homer's. Scholars do believe that there was an actual Hesiod to whom certain works can be attributed, but other material circulates under his name that was clearly composed by other figures. The two complete Hesiod poems that we have are the Theogony and the Works and Days. As the title suggests, the Theogony describes the origins and activities of the gods, including the creation story at the start of this lecture. The Theogony is written as a hymn of praise offered by the Muses themselves. Works and Days, by contrast, focuses more on the world in which we humans live, but it's set against the theological backdrop presented in the Theogony. Hesiod, then, is a nice complement to Homer. He spells out the mythological history that Homer only alludes to. Finally, a group of later writings is known as the Orphic material. This includes poems and hymns dating from the end of the 6th century and later. Orphic material is traditionally attributed to a mythical poet named Orpheus, but scholars tend to argue that multiple authors wrote under the pseudonym Orpheus. This wasn't unusual for the time. In several ancient cultures, authors would associate their work with the authority, personality, style, and themes of one umbrella name. The Orphic corpus includes literature from around 6th century BCE all the way through the 5th century CE. Orphic material has a dark note to it, or at least a note of mystery, even strangeness. It probably grows out of an idiosyncratic religious community dedicated to the worship of Orpheus, a hero with superhuman musical talents who tried to rescue his wife from the underworld. One ancient author warns that Orpheus's poetry is something strange and riddling for people. The Orphic material often includes writings that we don't find in Homer or Hesiod. Even more interesting, sometimes it presents different versions of stories told elsewhere. For example, Orpheus's version of the War of the Titans differs a bit from Hesiod's version. According to Orpheus, in order to make it easier for Zeus to attack his father, Rhea hosted a banquet to which Kronos was invited. During the banquet, Rhea plied Kronos with alcohol, and Kronos became drunk. This made it possible for Zeus to get close enough to Kronos to castrate him, without Kronos putting up much of a fight. Also, the Orphic texts state that when Zeus decided to turn over his throne to his son Dionysus, the Titans grabbed the child, and they tore him limb from limb in a savage attack. They put his dismembered body in a pot to boil, and they roasted his limbs over a fire. When Zeus found out about this, he destroyed the rebellious Titans with his thunderbolt, and Dionysus was reborn because the goddess Athena was able to preserve his heart. The wealth of written sources on Greek mythology has taught us a great deal, but there are other wonderfully illuminating sources as well. We find images from Greek mythology on personal items such as pottery, especially vases, plates, and bowls. Archaeologists have found ancient Greek flasks from the 5th century with images that can easily be identified as the gods Poseidon and Persephone. They've also found jewelry with images of the demigod Heracles, called Hercules by the Romans, fighting the many-headed Hydra. The Judgment of Paris, the beauty contest between the goddesses Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite that we'll discuss in the next lecture, is captured on red clay pottery as early as the 6th century BCE. Think about what this says about the importance of myth to the ancient Greeks. Think too about our own world. We put celebrities and their names on t-shirts, lunchboxes, and clothing brands. But true heroes, men and women whose achievements transcend their own lifetimes, continue to be memorialized permanently. Think of Lincoln on his chair at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., the 4 presidents on Mount Rushmore, the Vietnam War Nurses Memorial. True heroes are captured in stone. The highlights of Greek mythology were also displayed in architecture. Public buildings functioned like the stained glass windows of medieval Christian churches many centuries later. The Greek temples told their culture's sacred stories, and they saw these stories as part of their religious as well as cultural life. Temple friezes, pediment areas, and the large stone panel sections known as metopes were particularly popular places for decorative sculpture or painting that illustrated scenes from important myths. For example, on the Parthenon, the great temple at Athens, all 14 metopes on the front or the east of the temple include scenes of the Gigantomachy, the primordial battle between the giants and Olympian gods that followed the War of the Titans. On the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, the 12 metopes are dedicated to the 12 labors of Heracles. The base of the great altar at Pergamon offers another, even more dramatic depiction of the Gigantomachy. Public spaces such as the great altars and temple panels were the billboards of their day, providing a 24/7 public recitation of key mythological moments, and reminding folks how and why religious practices had been instituted in the past. Sometimes the artifacts and architectural elements offer the earliest evidence of a myth that we have, predating the literary sources available to us by several centuries. and sometimes archaeological work has raised questions about whether a myth is entirely mythical after all. German archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann traveled to Mycenae in the 1870s because ancient Greek mythology declared it to be the home of King Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, and commander-in-chief of the forces against Troy during the Trojan War. Schliemann had already excavated the apparent site of Troy itself, and he discovered a walled city and royal treasure, even though most scholars had dismissed the possibility that the Trojan War had actually occurred. Schliemann excavated a site on the Mycenae Acropolis and found deep shaft graves. In those graves he found bodies, decorated in elaborate death shrouds, including face masks of gold and electrum. Schliemann believed he had actually found the body of King Agamemnon. Now, while most scholars dispute this, his discoveries suggest that certain places and events mentioned in the Iliad and the Odyssey might actually have existed in history. The various sources of information we have on Greek mythology and history allow us to make several broad generalizations about the nature of Greek myths. There are, of course, exceptions to these points, but they apply in many instances. First, Greek myth reflects the world in which it originated, and the key aspect of Greek life is that it was local life. We tend to think of ancient Greek culture as growing out of one homogeneous nation, one extended happy family, but that wasn't the case. The ancient Greeks didn't think of themselves as Greeks. They thought of themselves as Athenians or Spartans. Their loyalties were so strong that individual city-states often developed bitter rivalries between one another, and these rivalries occasionally erupted into full-on war. Many of the myths now associated with important Greek gods and heroes probably originated as individual short stories that were first created in specific cities and regions. Over time, as traders traveled, communities migrated, and different empires conquered one another, individual tales and story clusters were shared and adapted. For example, many of the labors of Heracles are linked to specific places. It's probable that several of the Heracles stories originated as stories about local heroes. As the Heracles oral tradition spread and grew in popularity, it probably absorbed these local stories and replaced the local hero with Heracles. This is a common phenomenon in orally based traditions, and it explains how disparate episodes become linked with one another. Ultimately, it becomes impossible to extricate individual stories from one another, or to describe certain clusters of stories without referencing other clusters of stories. In addition to reflecting local identity, Greek mythology was meant to be instructive. The Greek myths include basic stories about the natural world and man's relationship to that world. For example, the Titans represented forces of nature, the wind, the sea, and storms. The defeat of the Titans mythologized humanity's ability to harness these forces, to capture them, if you will. Myth worked like good advertising. It took abstract concepts, such as man's struggle to control forces that could be threatening or chaotic, and then it turned them into concrete figures, such as primordial gods. Greek myth also taught geography. The Iliad and the Odyssey instructed Greeks indirectly on the location of Greece with respect to its environs, by transporting them from the Greek mainland to the war at Troy, and from there on a tour of the rest of the known world via Odysseus's travels. But it wasn't just physical geography that Homer's poetry conveyed. In the Iliad, for example, the shield of the great Greek warrior Achilles features a map of the cosmos. Homer describes Achilles' round shield in detail, beginning with the center and moving outward. The center includes the earth, the sky, the Mediterranean Sea, the sun, the moon, and the stars. The next layer includes two noble cities filled with mortal men, one ruled by law and blessed by a wedding, the other under siege. The next circle shows a field being plowed, and the fourth depicts a king's estate in the midst of harvest. The fifth circle includes a vineyard, and the sixth circle includes a herd of long-horned cattle being attacked by lions that are being fought off by the cattlemen. The seventh circle shows a peaceful sheep farm, and the eighth circle depicts a dancing scene with young men and women. Finally, the ninth circle shows the great primordial ocean that cradles the entire created world. Achilles' shield is more than a beautiful object in Homer's myth. In that shield, Homer provides a visual image of what Achilles and his fellow warriors are trying to protect, the Greek way of life. The violence and the devastation of the Trojan War is set in sharp relief against the peaceful life the warriors had left behind, not knowing if they would ever see it again. The Iliad then offers more than a great story. It offers a meditation on war and the violence that it brings. Other Greek myths also reflect the violence and the insecurity of the centuries between Greece's archaic period, the conquests of Alexander the Great, and the eventual end of Greek domination of the ancient world. In 146 BCE, Rome took over the Greek islands and peninsula. Greek culture continued to exert tremendous influence after this time. Many would argue, in fact, that Rome conquered Greece politically and militarily, but Greece conquered Rome culturally. As we'll see in later lectures, Rome basically adopted Greek mythology, thus preserving it for future generations, including our own. Greek mythology sets the stage for human endeavor. It explains in story form the world into which the ancient Greeks understood they had been born. A world with natural, social, moral, and cosmic components in conflict with one another. But as we will see, it also speaks to modern audiences by issuing a kind of existential declaration. Human beings do not get handed a blank slate. Instead, humanity steps into Act 2 of a play already set in motion, but with no scripts or clear stage directions. It's up to human beings to negotiate the various moving parts already working at full speed and to figure out where to go from here. The various Greek mythological figures, the gods, heroes, and mythical creatures, can provide advice and limited assistance, but they do not control the outcome, and they may or may not want to help in any case. We'll also see that other cultures present alternative existential views. One benefit of learning about many Greek mythologies together is that they invite us to compare how different cultures have positioned humanity in the cosmos. As we continue our exploration of Greek mythology, the Titans will fade away. Their enemies, the Olympic gods, will take center stage, and we'll pick up their stories in the next lecture. But it's helpful to remember that many of the themes and much of the content that we find in Greek mythology has roots stretching back to the Titans. We continue to find references to Titans in contemporary culture as well. Many athletic teams take their name from the Titans, not to mention the ill-fated ocean liner. In all these cases, the name Titans connotes physical strength and power, but it also includes an element of the bittersweet and a wistful recognition that the strength of one age always gives way eventually to the vigor of a generation yet to come. References to the Titans are not, of course, the only way that modern athletics carries on ancient Greek traditions. As you surely know, the ancient Olympics themselves were a Greek invention. The first modern Olympic Games, held in 1896, included a men's 26-mile foot race called a marathon. Some say that the marathon was named after a legendary run by an unknown Athenian soldier. The Persians invaded Athens in 490 BCE, and when the Athenian army defeated the Persians at the Battle of Marathon, A runner was sent to announce the news. He ran 26 miles and 385 yards to announce the victory. Legend has it that when he arrived, he exclaimed, "We won," and then he collapsed and died. The story of this runner, as used by the modern Olympics, is a kind of origins myth. It explains how today's marathon race came into being. There's only one problem. Evidence suggests that this story is historically inaccurate. It probably never occurred. But from a mythological perspective, this doesn't matter. What does matter is that the story gives meaning to the modern marathon by supplying meaningful origins. Men and women who run marathons now, particularly in the Olympics, can imagine themselves stepping into the shoes of an ancient runner who gave his life to bring news of victory to the Athenians. When the organizers of the modern Olympics included the marathon, they were trying to promote certain values: individual honor, love of country, and a celebration of human physical strength that transcends national boundaries. By associating the modern games with this mythological run, the organizers were hoping to give a mere foot race eternal meaning. And that's what myths do and have done from ancient times until today. Myths provide guidance. Their explanations are never primarily informational. They are meant to be transformational. We are meant to change how we live in light of the myths of our culture. We think and act in certain ways based on how we are oriented to our fundamental life circumstances, and myth provides this orientation. It guides our choices by telling us where we belong in the cosmos and in society. Myths explain the nature of life and death, the nature of true love, even the nature of a well-lived life. Of course, myths are always open to reinterpretation, even to challenges. Undoubtedly, the strange tales of the Titans held meanings for the Greeks that we don't find in them today. In the lectures to follow, we'll see that myths are rooted within individual communities, but they are also transmitted from one culture to another. And some myths evolve as they spread from one culture to another, adapting to new historical events, to cultural settings, and to scientific discoveries. It's this reinterpretation and adaptation that keeps myth alive. And yet, happily, myths always retain something of their origins. As a result, stories such as those of the Titans allow us to explore some of the deepest thought of people whose ancient ways of life might otherwise be impossible to imagine. We begin this lecture by looking at one of the most famous stories in Greek mythology, the Judgment of Paris. The story begins with Zeus, the supreme Olympic god, hosting a banquet at the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, the future parents of the Greek hero Achilles. Zeus fails to invite Eris, the goddess of discord. Out of spite, Eris decides to disrupt the festivities by coming anyway, and she brings a special object to the event, a golden apple from the famous garden of Hesperides. The apple is inscribed with the phrase, "For the fairest one." She tosses this apple into the crowd and leaves the rest to her understanding of Greek goddess vanity. Immediately, three goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, lay claim to the golden apple, each declaring that she is the fairest of all. The goddesses demand that Zeus decide which one of them deserves the apple. For once, Zeus is smart, and he refuses to judge between them. Instead, he passes the choice on to Paris, mortal prince of Troy. Paris finds it difficult to choose between the goddesses, and on the sly, each goddess tries to bribe him with a gift. Hera offers to make him ruler over all Europe and Asia, and Athena offers him wisdom and skill in warfare. But Aphrodite appeals to his baser instincts, and she offers him the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Sparta. Paris is persuaded by this, and he declares Aphrodite the winner of the golden apple. I like to think of this as the original Miss Universe pageant, a contest that brings out the worst in almost everybody involved including some backstage intrigue and corruption. More seriously, this story highlights a classic element of Greek mythology, the importance of the goddesses in both the divine and the human realms. Last time, we spent a lot of time focused on the gods in Greek mythology, the Titans and their descendants. In this lecture, we're going to focus on Greek goddesses, particularly Aphrodite and Athena, because their personalities and their interactions with the gods and with humans are crucial to Greek mythology and to Greek understanding of human nature. We'll see that these goddesses are complex characters, they're powerful, and yet morally flawed, fulfilling many common stereotypes of women while simultaneously wielding great influence. We begin with Athena. Athena was perhaps the most important Greek goddess of all. As the Judgment of Paris story suggests, she was known as the goddess of war. While Ares, the male god of war, was associated with bloodlust and violence, Athena was associated more with the statecraft of war, its use as a political weapon. Think of Ares as the god of dodgeball and Athena as the goddess of chess. Athena was not an emotional warrior. Her chief concern was politics, and she's known for empowering leaders, primarily men, with the skills they need to negotiate politically difficult situations effectively. Athena tends to display sophisticated calculation and strategy skills rather than sheer bloodlust. Some have said she represents ennobling war, that is, righteous war waged to protect family or the city-state, known as the polis. She empowers hero warriors, not simply with strength and weapons, but with intelligence and cunning. For example, Athena is the goddess who comes to Odysseus' aid when he returns from his 20-year journey to and from the Trojan War, disguising him when he returns to the city so that he can surprise his rivals. In doing so, she not only upholds the hero, she also upholds the institution of the family. Athena's mythological origins are interesting, and they provide some insight into her unique role in Greek mythology. Zeus, Athena's father, is warned that a child of his will be born who is superior to him. In an effort to prevent that child's birth, Zeus swallows the child's mother, Metis, while she is pregnant. Now remember, Zeus's own father, Kronos, had swallowed all of Zeus's siblings in an attempt to prevent them from rising up against him. So clearly swallowing runs in the family as a preferred coping strategy. When Athena is born, then, she emerges into the world from her father, not her mother. In addition, Athena emerges full-grown and fully armed from Zeus's head, an unnatural birth, and one that marks her as having a close relationship to Zeus. While she has political savvy and cunning, all of her abilities are put to Zeus's service. She's the original daddy's girl. Athena never really uses her abilities for her own advancement. She's her father's first lieutenant, his right-hand man, as it were. Athena is also linked to legal courts. In fact, she is credited with establishing the original trial court in Athens in order that justice might be done in a dramatic case. According to Greek legend, a mortal man, Orestes, murdered his mother, Clytemnestra, who herself had killed her husband, King Agamemnon. Agamemnon had incurred her wrath by sacrificing their daughter, Iphigenia, to appease an angry goddess, and to enable the Greek fleet to set sail for Troy at the start of the Trojan War. According to the story, the king, Agamemnon, spent 10 years away from his throne, fighting at Troy. Unfortunately, his wife, Clytemnestra, began an affair with Agamemnon's cousin during his absence, and when Agamemnon finally returned, Clytemnestra murdered her husband, hacking him to death in the bath with an axe. Agamemnon's son, Orestes, then returns to his father's land after a long exile, and he vows to avenge his father's death. After considering whether or not to actually do the deed, Orestes ultimately stabs his mother. At this point, Orestes begins to be haunted by the Furies, female spirits who cry out for vengeance against the man who killed his own mother. In fact, Orestes' family is accursed, and multiple family members have killed one another, and it seems as if the cycle of bloodshed and vengeance will never end. Finally, Orestes turns to Athena for aid. Athena ends the cycle of vengeance by establishing a court to hear Orestes' case. This court, often called the First in Athens, is assembled to hear the case brought against Orestes and to render a final judgment. In this trial, Orestes' defense is that any child belongs more to the father than to the mother. Therefore, in killing his mother, Orestes argues that he was rightfully avenging the murder of his father. The human judges become deadlocked in their verdict, and Athena ends up casting the deciding vote. She agrees with Orestes' view on filial loyalty, and she acquits Orestes of any crime. Athena's logic is that defensive family ultimately means upholding the father's will. As a goddess, Athena is all business, and she has no real erotic appeal worth mentioning, although the Judgment of Paris story indicates that she is stereotypically vain about her looks. Unlike almost every other Greek goddess, Athena never takes a consort, so she is known as Athena Parthenos, or the Virgin Athena. The famous Greek structure known as the Parthenon, originally a temple built to Athena, is understood by many scholars to refer to Athena's virginity. The ancient Greeks would have understood the term virginity to refer to her independent social status, which was highly valued socially and in certain ritual contexts. Think of Queen Elizabeth's power as the Virgin Queen. No man ruled over her. In this case, no god ruled over Athena, except one could argue her father Zeus. Since Athena is a virgin, she also never gives birth, although certain myth variants give her children by other means. Hephaestus, the craftsman god, tries to force Athena to have sex with him, but she escapes. When she does, his sperm falls to the earth, and Gaia, the goddess of the earth, becomes pregnant instead. Eventually, Athena becomes foster mother to this child, Erichthonios, who is guarded by a serpent. In a variation on this story, Gaia actually gives birth to the serpent itself, as well as to the child. In both cases, Athena is given the child to foster. Erichthonios is said to have eventually become the first king of Athens. Instead of fulfilling a traditional mother's role, however, Athena serves as the patron goddess of the city-state Athens. She's usually depicted armed, helmeted, carrying a shield and a spear, and wearing an aegis, a fringed bib, probably made from an animal skin, with the head of a gorgon on it. The Iliad says that her aegis was ageless and immortal. 100 tassels of pure gold hang fluttering from it, like tight wool in each of them, and each the worth of 100 oxen. It's thought that the aegis acted as a kind of a protection for Athena, and it's a concrete sign of her other role, that of a warrior. The goddess Aphrodite provides a sharp contrast to Athena. Like many of the gods, Aphrodite has a long, rich history predating the classical Greek period, which is generally said to have lasted from about 500 to 323 BCE. We know that it was fairly common for ancient Near Eastern cultures to include a love goddess of some kind or another, and Aphrodite myths certainly seem to draw from these traditions. Some scholars believe that Aphrodite has roots in the goddess referred to in the Bible as Ashtoreth, the main goddess of the Phoenicians. This goddess was associated with fertility and nature, but by the time Aphrodite emerges in Greek mythology, she's become associated with love, not just biological fertility. Aphrodite is a well-developed character in Greek mythology, and there's a large collection of stories about her, ranging from her birth through a lively adulthood. There are different accounts of Aphrodite's birth. According to some traditions, Aphrodite was born on Cyprus, near Paphos, which was her primary center of worship. Other stories state that she was born near the island of Cythera. In yet another story, she is presented as the daughter of Zeus and Dione, a female Titan. Hesiod presents the most colorful story of her birth. He states that she was born from the foam, created when Kronos castrated his father Uranos and threw his genitals into the ocean. Her name reflects this myth. Aphrodite literally means arisen from foam. Aphrodite was carried to shore on a scalloped shell, and that's why her Roman counterpart, Venus, appears standing naked on a large shell in Botticelli's famous painting, The Birth of Venus. Like Athena, Aphrodite springs to life as a fully formed, beautiful young adult woman. Because of this, and because she's the goddess of love, she's often portrayed nude. She is also characterized as vain, self-centered, and willful. I often think of her as a 20-something Paris Hilton, wealthy, beautiful, and completely self-absorbed. She is constantly seeking praise and attention for her beauty. And although she's married to Hephaestus, she is also constantly involved in amorous relationships with a wide variety of other men. Most of the mythology centered on Aphrodite centers on the combination of her beauty, her vanity, and her wild love affairs. Aphrodite's best-known love affair is with Adonis, the Phobio of Greek mythology. The most detailed story about Aphrodite and Adonis appears in Book 10 of Ovid's Metamorphoses. According to the myth, a mortal woman, Myrrha, refused to worship Aphrodite. As punishment, Aphrodite made Myrrha seduce her own father. When her father discovered that he'd been sexually involved with his daughter, he almost killed her. But the gods took pity on her and transformed Myrrha into a tree, a myrrh tree, and Adonis was born from that tree. Aphrodite brought him to the god Hades so that the goddess Persephone, whom we'll discuss in more detail later, could raise him. When Aphrodite returned to visit him, Adonis had grown into a drop-dead, gorgeous young man, and Aphrodite fell head over heels in love. Aphrodite and Persephone began to fight over him until finally Zeus interceded. In an attempt to resolve the problem, Zeus decreed that Adonis would spend a third of the year with Persephone, a third of the year with Aphrodite, and the remaining third of each year with whomever he chose. Not surprisingly, Adonis chooses the beautiful Aphrodite. They begin their time together, but at a certain point, Aphrodite is forced to leave Adonis for a brief period, and she warns Adonis not to hunt any animal that appears fearless. Adonis quickly forgets her warning, and he hunts a large wild boar. The wild boar turns on Adonis, castrating him, and Adonis eventually dies from loss of blood. Aphrodite returns too late to save him. As a memorial gesture, she causes anemones to grow where his blood spilled, and she establishes an annual festival to be held in his memory. This myth displays several of Aphrodite's most important qualities. First, of course, she's beautiful, which is why Adonis chooses to spend time with her. Second, however, she's extremely self-centered. We've seen this already in the Judgment of Paris, and her vanity comes out again in the stories linking her with Adonis. In this cycle of myth, she directs all of her energy toward Adonis, completely ignoring the fact that she's married to another god. Not that the Greek male gods were models of fidelity either. In addition, it's suggested that the wild boar that attacks Adonis is actually the god Ares in disguise, angry because he himself was Aphrodite's lover until Adonis came along. In general, Greek mythology indicates that Aphrodite's unfaithfulness causes lots of difficulties for others. This is most clear in the aftermath of the Judgment of Paris. After Aphrodite wins the golden apple, she makes good on her promise to Paris and brings him to Helen of Sparta. Paris either seduces or abducts Helen. Different versions give different accounts, but in any case, Helen leaves her husband and is taken to Troy, thus sparking the most well-known war in Greek mythology. This story makes clear the full extent of Aphrodite's vanity. Bottom line, she causes a world war just to win a beauty contest. Aphrodite is the original femme fatale, causing the death of thousands of men just to stroke her own ego. Over the centuries, the character of Aphrodite evolved a bit in Greek mythology. By the late 5th century BCE, philosophers began to argue that there were actually two Aphrodites. The first is the celestial Aphrodite, born of the sea foam. This goddess is ethereal, serene, and beautiful in a look but don't touch kind of way. The second is the common Aphrodite, whose parents are Zeus and Dione, and whose vanity and sexual exploits leave a trail of ruin. The Neoplatonists, a 3rd century philosophical movement, invoked the distinction between the celestial and the common Aphrodite in their own philosophical work. The Neoplatonists taught that there is a singular one, or a good, beyond all being, and this good informs ethical behavior. They argued that the celestial Aphrodite should be associated with spiritual love, which is associated with the purifying virtues, while the common Aphrodite should be associated with physical love or desire, which ties the soul to sensuality. I'll discuss Hera, the 3rd goddess involved in the judgment of Paris, in a moment. But what do we learn about Greek culture from the mythology surrounding Athena and Aphrodite? A little bit of history might be helpful here. Athena actually has a long history prior to the Greeks. Plato associated her with a minor Egyptian goddess named Neith, who was linked to war and the hunt. This Egyptian goddess had roots going back to pre-dynastic Egypt. As time passed, Athena developed into a goddess associated with various arts and crafts, including metalworking. It's possible that this led to an association with weaponry, which is made of metal, and eventually to an association with warcraft. As the ancient Greek city-states coalesced, distinct communities tended to identify specific gods or goddesses as their patrons. Deities assigned the task of protecting the region. One myth asserts that Poseidon and Athena competed for the right to be the patron deity of Athens. Athena won by offering the people of Athens the olive tree, symbolically offering the fundamental resources of wood, oil, and food. In any case, as Athens rose in importance, so did the deity associated with the city. But it's helpful to remember that Athena originated centuries earlier as a simple hunter goddess. If these historic connections are accurate, then Athena's history goes back centuries before she becomes the center of a worship cult in classical Greece. Aphrodite's roots are a little less clear. As I noted earlier, some scholars have linked her with Phoenician, Assyrian, and Etruscan religious traditions, but there's no clear lineage. What does seem certain is that Aphrodite has historical roots in the religious traditions that preceded the Greeks, and it's clear that other gods and goddesses have similar pre-histories. When we think of these histories, it becomes easier to see that Athena and Aphrodite, like the other Greek gods and goddesses, are exhibit A and B for the fact that the Greeks absorbed elements of the cultures around them, and then they tailored these elements to their own needs. In other words, the Greeks were masters at appropriating the cultures of the communities that nurtured them, as well as communities they encountered through trade and military conquest. The Greeks took cultural elements from all of these communities and made them their own, and Athena and Aphrodite are classic examples of this dynamic. This raises an important point about myths in general. We tend to think of myths as springing fully formed into specific cultures, and most of us think of the ancient Greek myths as, well, Greek. But the Greeks drew heavily from their predecessors and neighbors, just as later cultures, especially the Romans, would draw from them. Because of this, it's best to think of mythologies as living entities, always on the move, shape-shifting as they pass from culture to culture. Turning back to Athena and Aphrodite, it would be tempting to use the goddesses as a kind of a bellwether, reflecting the experiences of real women in Greek society. After all, Athena and Aphrodite play a wide range of roles. Isn't it natural to assume that real ancient Greek women were free to do so as well? Unfortunately, this is not the case. The Greeks, for all their advanced ideas, maintained very limited traditional roles for women. Women weren't permitted to be active in Greek government or in public life, and their status was determined completely by their fathers or their husbands. Women simply were not equal to men, despite the important role that goddesses such as Athena played in Greek civic life. The goddesses, unfortunately, are not a reflection of ancient Greek feminism. Instead, it is far more accurate to think of Athena and Aphrodite as contrasts to the real world that mortal Greek men and women inhabited. Once we realize that Athena and Aphrodite don't reflect reality, we're free to notice that in fact these two women figures never actually play any traditionally approved female roles. Neither of them is born as a baby. They both spring into existence as full developed young women. They never get to be Greek girls, and even as adults they don't play traditional roles. Athena never marries, she never even takes a consort, and she never gives birth. Her responsibilities seem to lie elsewhere in war and in upholding justice. Aphrodite, by contrast, is the embodiment of sexuality. She's constantly seducing or being seduced, at the same time that she's married. Athena is the warrior virgin. Aphrodite is, shall we say, loose. And these goddesses stand out at least in part because they don't live the lives of ordinary Greek women. Here we should note that other goddesses may come closer to reflecting women's lives in ancient Greece. But even when we examine these other female figures, the picture isn't reassuring. For example, consider Hera. Hera was married to her brother Zeus, and she represented marriage and childbirth. However, she's got her own set of problems. Zeus was a well-known philanderer, and Hera spends much of her time angry because of his very public infidelity. This is not a woman who stands by quietly. Instead, Hera goes ballistic on her husband, his mistresses, and his children. And some scholars have suggested that uncomfortable relationships between the goddesses and the gods may reflect some historical cultural dynamics that we prefer not to know about. The dysfunction we see between the gods and the goddesses may reflect genuinely difficult dynamics between Greek men and women. We know that marriages among the leading families were largely politically and financially driven, and women were not equal partners in those marriages from society's point of view. This probably led to significant tensions in certain households. I imagine the Greek high society marriages may have been more like The Good Wife than the Cosbys. Other scholars view the relationships between gods and goddesses more metaphorically. Now, these scholars will argue that the tensions played out between individual gods within the myths symbolize broad cultural dynamics. For example, Hera's difficult marriage to Zeus can be understood to reflect the difficult merging of pre-Hellenic culture and the conquering culture that eventually prompted the development of classical Greek culture. In other words, Hera and Zeus don't represent human beings. They each represent entire cultural communities, clashing as they interact. Carl Jung argued that Greek mythology used external conflicts between individuals and communities to express the cultural trauma experienced by pre-Hellenic culture when invaders occupied the Greek islands. Take, for example, the story of Persephone's rape. According to the tradition, the virgin Persephone was kidnapped by Hades, the god of the underworld, and held captive against her will. Ultimately, she was tricked into staying with Hades for half the year perpetually. Well, according to Jung, the story of Persephone's rape isn't really about physical rape at all. Instead, it represents the rape of pre-Hellenic culture. Now, while this approach may be a bit extreme, it's not unreasonable to think that stories of the goddesses spoke to anxieties and concerns that resonated with entire communities, not just with individuals. Some scholars argue that goddess figures like Aphrodite diminish steadily over time, so that by the time we reach Homer and Hesiod in the 8th century BCE, they've largely been relegated to supporting roles, as wives, lovers, and mothers to the gods. But while the goddesses for the most part lose their cultic centers, their mythology has actually survived for thousands of years. This leads us to our final question. Why do the myths of the goddesses persist? What do the myths of the goddesses have to offer us today? Given the strong personalities and colorful adventures of the Greek goddesses, it's tempting to turn to them as role models for the modern era. Could Greek mythology offer an alternative to monotheistic patriarchy? Sadly, I think the only honest answer is no. Overwhelmingly, Greek goddess mythology, while fascinating, tends to reinforce traditional patriarchal dynamics in several ways, as we've already seen. In addition, the goddesses find themselves in stereotypically female quandaries, competing with one another for the love of a god or a human man, fighting on behalf of their children, and fending off would-be rapists or suitors. The goddesses' problems probably mimic the problems of ancient Greek mortal women, whose lives were driven in large part by the choices of their fathers, their husbands, and even their sons. Hera, Zeus's wife, is constantly dealing with the consequences of his infidelities. Goddesses and mortal beauties are pursued by suitors for their looks alone. Often female beauty becomes the provocation for conflicts between individual gods, men, or entire city-states. Greek mythological heroes are rewarded by being given the girl. It's like watching the worst of network television. In most of these scenarios, the Greek goddesses have little to no choice. But it wouldn't be fair to characterize the Greek goddesses as completely passive victims. They put their hurt and anger into action, and it's not pretty. Poor Hera spends most of her life trying to punish Heracles, her husband's bastard son. Aphrodite turns Medusa's hair into snakes, just so Medusa won't be pretty anymore. In many cases, the aggrieved goddess often goes to extreme lengths, becoming very difficult to empathize with. Some scholars argue that in these women, we see the antecedents of harsh European folktale figures, such as the cruel stepmother figure and the wicked witch. Other attempts have been made to use the Greek goddesses as poster women for feminism. French feminist Hélène Cixous argued in the 1970s for a reappropriation of Medusa as a powerful, positive role model for women. Other feminists have actually rewritten some of the Greek myths to give female figures more control over their lives. In one revision, Helen of Troy is no longer a kidnapped victim. She chooses to leave her husband to follow her own lustful desires, which are not being satisfied at home by her elderly husband. It's clear that any one-size-fits-all approach fails to capture the full breadth and complexity of the Greek goddess mythologies. However we interpret these myths, the stories of the goddesses, in addition to being highly entertaining, offer several insights into Greek culture. And we may simply have to be satisfied with that.